Welcome back. You're still tuned in to Salam Media News and Views with me, Salano Makwediri. Tomorrow, Saturday, the 25th of May, we'll be commemorating Africa Day, a very, very important day, an annual commemoration of the foundation of the Organization of African Unity on the 25th of May, 1963. It is celebrated in various countries on the African continent, as well as in the diaspora. And this year's theme is Educate an African Fit for the 21st Century. And we'll be speaking to master's graduate at Institute for Pan-African Thought and Conversation at University of Johannesburg, Orapeleng Matshediso, about Africa's role in the 21st century. Where do we measure ourselves with the rest of the world? We're going to also be chatting a bit about the silencing of guns in Africa agenda. This was a flagship initiative of the African Union's Agenda 2063, which aspires to end all wars and conflict, prevent genocide, and stop gender-based violence by 2063. Are we on course to that? Just speaking about Africa as a whole, economically, politically, are we becoming, a bit more stable, a bit more competitive in the global stage, when it comes to our continent and how we interact with the rest of the world. Orapeleng Matshediso is joining us via StreamYard. I'm sure you can see us, Orapeleng. Thank you so much for joining us on Salam Media and welcome.
No, good morning and good morning to the listeners. Thank you for inviting me to this conversation.
Tomorrow we are celebrating Africa Day, a very, very important day for, Africans, all those that are in the continent itself, and others that are in the diaspora. Do Africans really understand, the importance of this day and what it actually means?
Yeah, no, I think Africans do understand the importance of this particular day. But of course, I think on the ground, our people, ordinary citizens there, they need to be educated that this is an important day in African calendar. More so that in 1963, on the 25th of May, 32 countries that had gained independence at that particular time converged in Addis Ababa in Ethiopia to map out a plan for Africa's development and economic development in general terms. But it's important that we must also tell them that why it was celebrated, of course, in Ethiopia, because Ethiopia remains the a symbol of resistance against colonialism. Those are the most important things that we must educate our people, that we celebrate this important day, of course, from time to time, informed by the theme that is adopted yearly, to evaluate what progress have we registered in terms of advancing the program of African Union within that, but within the framework of a theme that might have been actually at that particular time agreed upon by African Union.
And speaking of this year's theme, which is educate an African fit for the 21st century, the world is increasingly being very, very competitive. But when we look specifically at Africans, are we coming to a point where we are now, as competitive as the rest of the globe, whether it's in geopolitics? Is our voice becoming a bit louder than it previously was, when it comes to, global discourse and how, whether it's in the UN or it's in, various organizations that are there for the broader betterment of the globe? Are Africans now more active than we've ever seen before? And if yes, what is behind this resurgence of the African voice?
I think I will answer your question in the fulcrum of the challenge of leadership in Africa with successive, of course, periods. One, I think, of course, responding to the theme, as we have indicated, that of course is the theme is based on, of course, educating Africans. It is important. I think that theme, it is taken within the context of African Union having analyzed analyzed what is projected, that by 2050, African continent will be the only continent in the world that will be having, of course, more than 60% of young people because most of the so-called superpowers of the West and the East, by that time, it will be having aging population. So I think we are positioning ourselves so that by that time, like the Tandai Kandawiri would say in 2014, that Africa's youth, dividends of having youth, it has a potential either to assist it to advance or to be a curse. But for it to be assisting to advance as a major resource, it's when we educate them, they've got a better understanding of where the continent has to go. What is the agenda, of course, behind what was agreed by the then leadership of African of Africa African African unity, unity, and of course, what is also important is that we need also to know that successive leaders of African continent have been coming with programs, but what becomes important is the thought of leadership, unity of some thought. You would see with NEPAD around between the first 8 years of NEPAD, it was moving. We had leaders who could go to global to increase the voice of African continent. The likes of Thabo Mbeki, Obasanjo of Nigeria, they took that particular idea and go to G8 summit, I think in 2022, 20, the year 2002, they went to advocate for that NEPAD and it was supported by the G8. And that was an indication. But unfortunately, when such leaders, because like Professor Samado Dafikeni would say, the problem with the African continent is that we are African Union and its precursor. We are more of adopting a leader-centric approach rather than institutionalization of the program. When those leaders leave, they live with that, and when they leave the office, others die. The ideas seem to be dying and rise at the time when we get leadership. I will make a practical example in conclusion. Uh, 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 how did the concept of 2063 comes about? After
Mm,
Mama Nkosazana Dlamini Zuma was elected chairperson of African Commission, he had a conversation, of course, with the then president of African Development Bank and the executive director of the United Nations Economic Commission for Africa. And in that, they conceptualized it because Mama Nkosazana Dlamini Zuma posed a question to them why Africa is not having a long-term vision, and that's how that came in. I think it's a matter of having a leadership that has got a common understanding of where we're supposed to go that can assist to raise the voice of Africa within the global system.
mm. You touched a bit on, that silencing the guns in Africa agenda, by 2063 initiative, led by Nkosazana Dlamini Zuma while she was at the helm at the AU. There's at least 15 armed conflicts in Africa. You have what's happening in the DRC currently. Cameroon is unstable. Ethiopia, Mozambique, our neighbors. South Sudan also experiencing, armed conflict there. Why can't Africa seem to, rid itself of armed conflict? It's something that's been a defining factor, for Africa for a very long time, where the whole world, when they think of Africa, they think of, these conflicts, the coups that happen across the continent. I mean, there was one just this week, which was squashed. I can't remember clearly the country, but there seems to be a lot of instability, and that this seems to be is definitely hampering the progress of Africa, economically, and also, just the general, lives of Africans and the potential that we have as a continent to compete in a global stage. Why can't we rid ourselves of this monkey on our back, the issue of armed conflicts, and the human rights abuses against civilians on the continent?
Yeah, no, thank you very much. I think you would agree with me that in as much as, of course, there are those challenges, but there is at least something that African Union, through African Union Security Council, that is happening. You would remember that South Africa being having 3 consecutive terms, being a non-permanent permanent member of the United Nations Security Council, has managed, of course, to ensure that there is that relationship between the United Nations Security Council and the African Union Security Council. And one of the critical issues was that as and when the intervention is made in the countries that, of course, are conflict ridden, what has to happen is that there must be adoption of what you call adaptability method of conflict resolution, allowing those particular countries to adopt their own way of resolving conflict rather than interference of the West. And I think that, of course, to a certain extent, is assisting. The last point that you need also to check is that this year in February, African Union had its own 37th summit in Addis Ababa in February 2024. And part of what it has done is that it has strengthened its African Union Security Council membership, of course, of other countries, adding other countries to strengthen it. I think that is an initiative, of course, that is there to assist. But the question that we need also to understand is that Africa today needs leaders more than ever before who can act locally and think globally. If we can have that cahoots of leaders, of course, because many writers, of course, or African scholars, they focus more on saying African leaders, they don't have political will to drive programs that are agreed upon. In my view, it's not only the political will, it is also about the thought leadership that we have. We need thought leadership that is mentally liberated with a critical consciousness of understanding where they operate and how to navigate through that particular stage. For an example, we are moving towards a multipolarity kind of the international system. It means Africa would need to reorientate its paradigm in pursuing development and refashioning its identity within the complex world so that it can devise international strategies that will benefit the continent. I will make example. Professor Vusi Gumede argues, and which I agree with him, that the reason why integration in Africa is not moving, because remember, some of this resurrection of conflict emerges because Africans are now becoming impatient with the process that was adopted of integration through regional economic structures. Now, he argues that the problem that we are not moving is because African leaders they have adopted the model of African Union in terms of integration without understanding that Africa itself it has its own social, economic, cultural dynamics. Because we must understand that as Africans, we are still as Africans in pursuit or the quest for what we term peace and peace, democratic governance, as well as cultural equality within the global stage. Who must carry that is the type of leadership that gets elected in our various states who should drive that particular agenda. It needs that Africa, unfortunately, for it to have a voice within the international spectrum, it has to first and foremost go there at least as a united force, like it happens during the era of Thabo Mbeki, Obasanjo, when they went to present the NEPAD as the Africa's vision or plan of action.
And just lastly, I want us to bring it back home a bit. South Africa's relationship with the rest of the continent is one that's, bittersweet, hot and cold, while on the other hand, South Africa plays a really, really important role, on the continent, whether it's, peacekeeping missions, diplomatic ties that we share with a lot of African countries, mediating in a lot of conflicts on the continent. There's an issue of xenophobia, where the rest of the continent sees, South Africa as very unwelcoming of other Africans. And, going into the elections, you now have a lot of political parties striking on that nerve, calling on South Africans, to, not let foreign Africans in the country, saying other Africans must leave the continent. What can we deduce? I mean, in the last 30 years of South Africa's democracy, how has our relationship with the rest of the continent evolved? And what can we say of it at this current moment?
I just attended a summit, of course, on Africa Day, a seminar, sorry, on Africa Day organized by the African Peer Review Mechanism and the Institute for Pan-Africanist Thought and Conversation. And in that summit, of course, uh, such issues were discussed. But what I'm going to say is that many present panelists at that particular summit said the challenge, like I said, that the issue of being leader-centric rather than institutionalizing Pan-Africanism. It's a problem that creates the emergence of xenophobia and so on and so forth. Because the reality of the matter is that we are not building people-to-people kind of relationship. To understand that as Africans, we experience the same challenges. Of course, we've got the same destiny through the Agenda 2063, building the Africa that we want. And then some of the speakers like Professor Samado Dafikeni said, he made an example that unfortunately, like it happened in Europe, many right-wing political parties emerged as a result of the mainstream progressive political parties failing to attend to the issue of immigration and migration, whether internally or externally. They should be able to provide direction with respect to that. But unfortunately, the emergence of Donald Trump and others came as a result of the failure of progressive forces to attend to the issue. Now the liberals came and defined, and they came home and say in South Africa, the mainstream political progressive forces are failing to attend to this particular issue because they see it as an emotive issue and sensitive. But the reality is existing. How do we then resolve that particular issue? It's quite important for stability of Africa and the stability of South Africa and Africans understanding each other from the perspective that all of us were colonized. We experience challenges. It might be at different levels, but we've got to come and resolve. Now, opposition parties, they are using these particularly to not genuinely address it, but they use it as electioneering kind of a strategy rather than saying this is what we need to do to address. So I think if we can be able to address that, sit down maybe post elections, we've got to sit down as a continent, as a country, uh, call on think tanks. The example that was made was that South Africa needs to have think tanks that advise the Department of International Relations, because that seems to have dissipated in this particular 10 years of democracy. There was a time when we had those particular think tanks, but it has, of course, dissipated. Example was made that Nigeria still has what you call Nigerian Institute for International Affairs that advise the ministry. So we need to have that in South Africa. Maybe post this, there must be a retreat of some sort, so that South Africa, more so that in 2025, it's going to be part of G20 and lead it as its presidency. What does that mean to South Africa? What does that mean to Africa? And the issue of some countries, of course, on the continent accusing South Africa of using its position within international space to advance its interest at the expense of the interest of the continent. Those are the debates that we've got to prepare ourselves ahead of the G20 that is going to be, of course, hosted by South Africa. And again, South Africa be the president of the G20. How do we then position ourselves? How do we fashion our identity as a continent? How do we reorientate our paradigm pursuing the development of the Agenda 2063?
All right, we're going to leave it there, Orapeleng. Thank you so much for your insights. And happy Africa Day for Saturday.
Thank you very much. I will be at Galaka, of course, celebrating it with the former president Thabo Mbeki. Have been invited, so I will be today late driving to Johannesburg to be part of the Africa Day celebration this Saturday at the Galaka Estate. Thank you very much, and thank you for the opportunity to share my thoughts.
Appreciate it that you have it there. Master's graduate at Institute for Pan African Thought and Conversation at the University of Johannesburg, Orapeleng Matshediso, giving us insight on Africa's role in geopolitics in the 21st century. Really, really wonderful interview and giving some nuggets of wisdom there when it comes to the continent and where we currently find ourselves. We're going to take a quick break. When we come back, it's 5 days before we head out to the elections, and I will be speaking to the Free State's only independent candidate, Siseng Ramotswabodi, after this.